the most interesting things is, this is not a place where we can just go back and ask, well, what did the founders think? And I mean, this was well pointed out, and I love that about this, because I think sometimes conservatives kind of overuse this argument that, well, it says in my Federalist Papers this, and so that's how it has to be. Well, I think this is one of my favorite books in the world. As you can probably tell, it's mostly tape on the outside now, but the founders did not understand how the Electoral College would work. And as soon as they began working it, after the Constitution was ratified, they never used it the way they thought it would work. Right? So we've got their kind of their words, and then we've got what they actually did, and basically it has worked the way the founders worked it since the beginning. Right? Electors have never been deliberators. Right? They have never sat down in state capitals and decided, I think this is the best person to be president of the United States. They've always acted as the agents of their state in some way, and almost always based on partisan allegiances. I mean, so the Electoral College, in that sense, has been very, not consistent with what they said at the Constitutional Convention, but extremely consistent since, particularly since 1796, the first competitive election. So what does it do? And I'll just tease you with this, and then I'll wrap up, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of good questions. What does it do? Two really important things, and some other things that we'll probably talk about later. First, it contains power over elections within the states. To put it really bluntly, there is no presidential appointee in Washington, D.C. in charge of presidential elections because of the Electoral College. Because your vote in Colorado is not thrown in the same pot as a vote from Texas or a vote from Illinois, right? And so Colorado can have its own rules, can run its own elections, and you have the equal protection guarantee in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which only applies within individual states, which is kind of an interesting little piece of constitutional trivia or oddity. The other thing that it does is, by decentralizing our elections, it holds national campaigns and candidates and parties to a higher bar than just the raw popular vote total. It says that just because you can be like Emmanuel Macron was in France, you get 23%, and that's enough to go to the runoff and become president of France because it's a directly democratic system. And that 23% could come from one narrow region in France, right? It could come just from Paris, and everybody else could hate him, and 23% would be good enough. Our Electoral College protects us from that kind of regional, radical, smaller and smaller plurality politics. And I would say, again, I think it sets a higher bar, actually, than a direct election system. So these are some of the reasons I think the Electoral College is worth preserving. Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst system of government except for everything else that's been tried. Lots of problems with the Electoral College, but I think it served us pretty well.
Awesome, thank you. So on that note, and you've already made me readjust the question order that I had, so that's good. So I want to start with you then, Trent, because you kind of alluded to this. But based on the Electoral College and the way we vote on other senators, state senators, the governor, for example, how can the system we use for electing pretty much every other elected official not be the right way to elect the president? And for example, should we, in Colorado, should the governor be elected by Electoral College of counties?
Well, I'll leave the last question to Coloradans. But you talk to people in California, and a lot of people are really frustrated with the fact that if you live in a state where the population has urbanized so much, it's not just that you're not represented, right? It's not so much. It's that people like you really can be left out of politics, right? And that's always a problem. There's not always something we can do about it, but it's never a good thing, right? We want an inclusive system to the extent that we can get that. No, scale matters. I mean, India is a great example of this. India has an electoral college. It works differently than ours. It's way more complicated. But they elect their president through a kind of electoral college system to provide some geographic balance. Germany elects their chancellor that way. And every parliamentary system has a similar effect. Right? When you scale up politics, you start running some extra risk. And that's why we have an electoral college and some of these other countries do similar things.
And let me ask you this then, and you alluded to this at California. When you have the Electoral College and polls are closing at 7 o'clock on the East Coast, but you have another 3 hours before California, and then you start getting Electoral College votes. To your point, perhaps, does the Electoral College vote prohibit people on the West Coast, or not prohibit, I guess is not the right word, keep people from going to the polls after work because they say, oh, I already see the way the Electoral College is going, my popular vote doesn't count. To your point, you mentioned earlier, California, does that discourage people? Do you feel that discourages people from getting out? Especially on the West Coast and even in our time zone.
Yeah.
You know, we start seeing Electoral College numbers coming in, you know, with still an hour, 30 minutes left in the voting.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I think that it sort of alludes to this greater point that I was making, which is just when you feel like your vote's not going to matter because it's already been decided via your geographic location, then you're just not as interested in participating in democracy. And I think that the regionalism question is a really interesting one because it is this question of should we look at the presidency as something that is an amalgamation of a nation or an amalgamation of states. And I think a lot of this debate comes down to that fundamental belief of whether you think the president is elected by the people or whether you think the president is elected by the state. And so with this question of where, like seeing all the states go blue, if I'm a Republican in California, do I even bother? I think you have this problem, and that like you said, as we scale up, it becomes more of a problem because you're dealing with a much larger percentage of the population. You're no longer dealing with, like if you're in DC and you see someone and you see the voting from Virginia and you're like, oh, well, maybe, I mean, it's just us, I could still go after work. But if you are watching the entire country, then you are discounting not just tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands and millions of people from feeling like they're going to have an opportunity to engage in this political process.
Right. Trent, how do you then, because people feel like their voice in this with a 3 million vote difference, isn't the national popular vote the only way to really ensure that every vote in every state will matter in every presidential election?
Well, I just answer that with a quote from a Senate report in 1977. I think speaks to that just perfectly, if I can find it here. Maybe I can't. Basically what it says is that we shouldn't allow mathematical abstractions to blind us to what I was talking about before, right? Which is all of this world of incentives that's created by the Electoral College. And I actually ran for the state legislature in Washington State, where I grew up once. And one of the realities, single member district, right? All the votes are mathematically equal. But anybody who's been in politics will tell you you're an idiot if you go out and knock on doors at random, right? Or if you start with the people who live down the long driveways, right? I mean, right? You never do that, right? I mean, anybody who's volunteered for a candidate to go knock doors, right? You start in subdivisions, right? Or if you can get into the condos or something, right? I mean, there are differences that the simple mathematical calculation, I think, miss, and so I think anybody claiming that any particular political system is just going to kind of be this panacea where everybody's going to have equal power, it's not that the Electoral College is perfect. Again, it's that none of those other promises ring true.
Do either of you feel like what happened in 2016 will discourage people from voting in 2020 because their vote won't matter when 3 million people pick one person, or as in 2000, what was it, 1.2 or 1? Can't remember the difference.
Around a million.
It was about Florida, right? Do you guys feel, or is there a concern that when things like this happen, and now it's happened twice in less than 5 elections, that people will start going, never mind?
Yeah, I would say that one of the reasons that this conversation is even being talked about right now is because of this phenomenon. I think that, as we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of historic inertia with the Electoral College, so that when it's not problematic, we don't really think about it. Mm-hmm. And that's true of a lot of political problems in our society, but just because there's a lot of historic inertia with it doesn't mean that it's not something that necessarily should change. So I think that when we think about the past election in terms of this particular issue, it actually is a great example of when we see that these old institutions maybe have come up against barriers that our new society that they can't overcome, and that maybe they need to be reevaluated. So I would say it's definitely, I'm sure, a concern that people have in the next election. Mm-hmm. But more than that, it's brought this conversation into the national consciousness in a way that's just making us reevaluate these sort of old institutions.
Trent, what do you think?
Well, when you look at voter turnout among the states and then also among different countries, the biggest factor, which is really hard to study, is I guess what I call political culture. Look at the Northeast, and states in the Northeast that have a town hall culture in their politics have really high turnout, whether they're swing states or safe states. And however, right, there is a little bit higher turnout in swing states, and I think some of that depends on if New Hampshire's a swing state, then swing state turnout's going to look even better, right? But one of the reasons I think the Electoral College is important is I think it diminishes the importance of the presidency just a little bit. It doesn't do it as much as I wish it did. Let me just say that. I think the imperial presidency is a disaster. I think Congress is a disaster. I think we have a lot of problems in our political structure today. But I wish we could get people, and I've actually spent some time trying to do this, to focus more on our state and local politics and less on DC. But this modern media that we have, right, inundates us with what's going on in DC and blinds us so often to the really important things that go on in our states and in our counties and our cities. So all that to say, I don't really disagree. There is an effect on turnout, but I think there's some other things going on, and I think we should address those things first.
Yeah, and then Kyra, I think you mentioned it in your opening statement, and I think this is an interesting conversation as well. And Trent, maybe you can start on this one. The battleground phenomenon, right? When we get down to the wire and you see somebody go to Michigan 12 times and the other candidate says, "Oh, I got Michigan wrapped up," and then they don't get it. But Colorado, I think we became a battleground state. Is the battleground phenomenon hurting the presidential election?
It is maybe not optimal, but it's better than the alternative. So the way it works right now, to be a credible political party, or really a credible candidate, you have to have support in a lot of states, right? And that's, we talk about safe states, right? Safe states are states where that party, for whatever reason, historically or recently or whatever, that party has already won over a majority of people in those states. And so it's not like that party doesn't care about those states. That party only exists because they have all those safe states, right? And then as the election wears on, then the candidates obviously focus more and more on whatever places are the most evenly divided. Isn't that better? Whether it's frustrating or not, isn't that better than a system that would tempt candidates to do just the opposite? So that the Democrats say, what we should do is go to the area where we're already strong, we're already polling 70-75%, and try to run up our vote total, radicalize our base electorate so that we get even more votes in the places where and where the Republicans do the same thing. We're going to go to the places where we're already getting 70 or 80% and just try to determine the election all based on turnout, not based on persuading people, not based on going to the same places where people, where at least the states themselves tend to be the most moderate. It is a frustration, but I think national popular vote isn't really an answer, and it's a frustration that we have in Senate races, gubernatorial races, congressional districts. I've lived in places where I knew the guy who was going to vote for was going to win. I knew the guy who was going to vote for was never going to win. it's always less than we want, right? We always want that chance that we're going to be that one decisive voter. And I live next door to that legislative district, actually, where it came down to a single vote, but I've never lived in it.
And Kyra, would the popular vote, do you feel like it would get rid of this battleground phenomenon that you mentioned?
Well, so with that, I actually think it's interesting that you bring up this idea of state politics versus national politics when you talk about the presidency, because I guess where I see this differently is I think that the national popular vote and everyone individually voting for the president would actually make state politics a lot more state-centric. Because when you're not focusing on national issues in your state, when people are not focusing on winning Florida, so pandering to the Cuban vote, or winning Michigan, so subsidizing the auto industry, then those states are a lot more in charge of the change of those industries and those populations and those people within that. So I actually think that instead of creating this sort of conflation of state and national politics, there's a potential with the national popular vote that you actually have a greater dissonance between what we see of as national politics and what we see of as state politics. And I would imagine that that can only be a good thing, because then you have states actually focusing on the issues of the people within the state, rather than maybe trying to get the president to see that your state is important, and maybe that your state's a swing state, and maybe that it could change.
Right. That kind of segues into then, to your points, how are we sure that this national popular vote interstate compact is going to be constitutional, or is it another issue where at the end of it all, a court is just going to strike it down? Yeah, I'd like you to start with that one, since that's your side of the ball.
Yes, no, that's definitely my burden. So yeah. I would say when we're having these discussions, it's important to remember that, or at least my perspective in this debate, coming to this debate, I think that it's a process. I don't think that we should go from Electoral College to national popular vote with one decisive factor within a year. I think that with anything that we talk about in this political system, it's sort of a stepping stone, and that ultimately, I mean, my belief is that the national popular vote should prevail, but that we can have these interim different types of systems that would over time change it. So, for example, when I was thinking about this, Nebraska and Maine have these sort of, you could call it almost a permutation of the national popular vote and the Electoral College, where the electoral votes are not based on a winner-take-all mentality. And so you have districts, the congressional districts, that determine the electoral votes, and that those electoral votes are then put forth to the Electoral College. Right. So I think starting with an amendment like that, where it answers a lot of these questions that are lacking in the Electoral College of voter participation and people feeling like their voice isn't heard, while on the path to maybe a more national popular vote, and that could be a very progressive and easy thing to amend and do, because you're not scrapping it all together.
Right. Trent, how do you feel about this compact, and what would happen? Do you feel the court would knock it down? Or?
I think you get really into the constitutional weeds really fast. And I've had people tell me, well, this is just obviously unconstitutional. And I will say that, I mean, it'd be an easy thing for me to say, right? That's not true. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is not obviously unconstitutional, nor is it obviously constitutional. I mean, there's no case law on it at all. I mean, nothing that's directly on point. It's an interstate compact. The Supreme Court has never enforced the compact clause in the Constitution that says those things have to be ratified, because because Congress did not want to be in the business of getting involved in your all river compacts, right? Water rights stuff, right? I mean, really, that's, Congress doesn't. They don't want to take votes on that. So they were happy for the Supreme Court to say, well, Congress could veto it, but doesn't have to approve it, which actually is what the Constitution says. But this is a different kind of compact. Congress probably would want to have a say in this. What would the court do? I don't know. Are there boundaries on the state legislature's power to give away their electoral votes this way? not on its face, but you can ask yourself this question, right? Could the Colorado legislature auction off Colorado's electors, right? Yeah, probably. I think a lot of people think that maybe there are some boundaries around that power in the Constitution after all. But again, there's no case law on it at all. So I would say constitutional jump ball, which is why I'm trying to stop it through the political process rather than with lawyers.
Let me ask you this, though, the point that Kyra brought up, what about the idea of whatever the way the district goes, that's where that electoral vote should go versus winner take all?
So the congressional district method that Maine and Nebraska use seems to work really well in states like that are on the smaller side. They have relatively, my understanding is relatively less gerrymandering than some states do. The problem in a lot of states, like if you did this in California is so heavily gerrymandered, or Texas or Pennsylvania or whatever. I mean, pick your gerrymander
or Colorado
or Colorado, right? I mean, the congressional district method elevates the importance of and the effects of gerrymandering, and if you applied it nationwide, it would reduce the amount of people who live in swing jurisdictions by like 50%. So that's why that's not a nationwide panacea. There are some other kinds of proposals to like have all the states go proportional, which at least would answer my concern about shifting power over elections to Washington, D.C., while making the Electoral College much closer, not mathematically perfectly, but much closer to the popular vote. I mean, but anyhow, I'll just leave it there.
All right, we'll let you leave it there. All right, I've got one more question off of my list, and then Jennifer's going through the questions from the audience, so we'll get to those. Last question I have for both of you. Kyra, I'll let you start. The last time there was a serious move to get rid of the Electoral College back in the in the 1970s, it was a bipartisan effort. It seems like that is a taboo or just a horrible word these days, and it drives me nuts. But why does this seem to have changed now? Why can't we be bipartisan on something like this? Where do you think that is grounded in the past 40 decades?
Well, I would say that it in many ways, talking about this is a symptom of a larger amount of divisiveness in the United States around our political questions. I think that it's very easy to toe the party line when someone's telling you what to think. And that happens so readily on both sides of the aisle that it creates no space for bipartisan thought on these issues. So I would argue that the reason that this has become a non-bipartisan issue is because it seems to be affecting one party more than both. And that if we could see it on both, that maybe there would actually be greater change because we would see that it's not a political issue. It's a question of how we choose to vote in this country. And so I think that it's actually why I wanted to do this debate and why I'm here is not to get into a political argument, because I don't think that it helps to just get into a political argument, but to show that this has become a partisan issue when it's a question of systematic change within our United States, and what we determine is the role of the presidential election within that. And so what I guess I would say is that I think it has been unfairly dragged into the partisan arena because of the parties that it has affected. And that if it had not so substantially affected just the Republican Party, that we wouldn't necessarily be having this conversation about partisanship.